Welcome to the TDS Early Years podcast. Now, each week we're going to be joined by different educational experts from across the globe who are going to offer exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help us as practitioners unlock all the potential for learning that there is in the early years. So to be first to hear about future episodes and to access all of the follow-up content, including ideas for your own setting, Pinterest, mood boards, and loads more, you can sign up for exclusive access using the link in our podcast description. Hello and welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guest today, Cheryl Hadland. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about how we can attempt to create a more sustainable learning environment and then in return really foster that love for and understanding of, I suppose, sustainability in early childhood. So welcome back, Cheryl.
Hi, Alistair. Thank you.
I think a good place to start is the idea that some of the concepts around sustainability are quite complex for adults to understand, especially around things like climate change. And then we are trying to kind of educate very young children to be the guardians of the planet in the future. It's how do you get that message for something that's really important and sometimes a little bit scary into a way that early years children can really kind of grasp and understand it realistically?
Yes, I think I was really taught about this. I did a postgrad course at Cambridge University on sustainable leadership. And one of the key takeaways I got from that is that you need to pitch sustainability at the right level to different people. So, I mean, the easier ones perhaps is if you're pitching sustainability to someone that's the bursar or the finance people, then you would do that from a money perspective. Now, I'm not going to do that now. But if you're pitching sustainability to children, it has to be really positive and really practical, the things that they can do to help, not dwelling on killing things that, if you don't put your plastic bag in the right bin, the turtle's going to die, because that can give them nightmares and actually doesn't help, because you probably know from your psychology, if somebody is frightened, then they're either going to go to freeze mode or fight mode. And they're certainly not going to be able to learn. So we've got to help them feel relaxed and positive and happy. And we can do that through doing positive things for the climate. So whether that's planting things or picking things up to put them in the place that they should be, whether that's in the recycling bin or whether that's, waste that they're picking up with their gloves and their pickers in the garden or in their drive. But it needs to be where they can be proud that they've actually done something to help. And to bear in mind that even little things do help. It's like the throwing the pebble in the pond, it cascades. So if we can teach one child not to throw their rubbish on the floor or out the car window, and then they can spread that to their siblings and their parents and the community and the other children in the park, then actually we can make a huge impact. So let's feel good about those little things.
Yeah, I really like that idea, because I think a lot of what we talk about are quite abstract concepts. So you putting your bottle in the right recycling bin will have an impact on, and that's so far removed from an early years child's where I live, what I understand, the me. So if we think about what we know about early years children, and the thing they know most in the world is who they are and where they currently reside, wherever that may be, then if we can make the sustainability about that so it makes sense to them, then you're right, they don't all necessarily need to know the bigger global picture.
No, I don't.
Because if we are talking about the ice caps melting and the polar bears dying,
that's so sad.
It's sad and frightening, and death is a difficult concept for small children anyway. But that kind of removed concept of death of an animal that lives kind of a million miles away.
There are better ways, aren't there, of doing death. You can do that with the hamster that died or the goldfish that died in the nursery, not with a polar bear. Yeah. And recycling, it's about sorting, learning about different materials and posting. I mean, lots of children have a schema that enjoys sorting and posting. So let's focus on that.
Yeah. And you can talk about how, and you can even do it when you bury things and they rot and they decompose. And again, I may have talked about this before on the podcast series, but I worked with an earlier setting where they'd found a pear at the bottom of their fruit basket that had gone really brown and mushy. And the children were really obsessed with this pear, in a good way and a bad way, lots of like, eh. So they created a fruit bowl under a plastic dome and they let it rot over a period of about 2 weeks and decompose. And the interest and the language and the green mold on the orange and the brown spots on the banana and they talked a lot about how, the fruit had done that, but the plastic dome had stayed exactly the same.
Yeah.
And then they talked about how you could use all the mushy fruit to make compost to feed the garden, but you couldn't, if you buried the plastic dome in the garden, wouldn't feed the garden. So it was a really simple, in the moment, relevant,
but that's
again, a lovely lesson
so
around kind of,
isn't it? I mean, you could talk about then introducing the worms and the wormery and how the worms don't like oranges and lemons, but we like orange and lemons.
Yeah.
And what we're going to do with the orange and lemon peels, we can use them to make nice smelling perfumes because we like the smell of oranges. There's so much you can do in a positive way that, frightening the living daylights out of them is not going to help. Also, I find that our colleagues can get very anxious. This isn't just children having nightmares. This can be our teenage staff and our young and even our older staff. I mean, I've been known to get anxious and depressed, thinking, oh my goodness, how can I do anything about it? But just knowing that you can just do those little things, and each little thing is important and worth celebrating, can turn that environmental they even call it eco anxiety now, can turn it round into something positive.
It is a truth, and I think when you are watching the news and you've got forest fires going on, or even in our country where we're experiencing really extremes of weather and flooding and all sorts of things that feel like the climate is kicking back. Yeah, adults do get really anxious, but I think one of the things you said there about little things can make a difference. If you are teaching early years children that kind of mantra, not necessarily directly linked to sustainability with my teeth in, but you're teaching them that idea that together we can make a difference that you necessarily can't make on your own, then that equally is as valuable, because you can then just lift that and transfer it into a range of things, but certainly into kind of a sustainability message.
Yes, I think that's really important. And for adults, I think role modeling what that looks like is helpful as well, because we can't be telling children, oh, you can't be eating sweeties in plastic wrappers, or if we do it ourselves. So I think it's very important as practitioners, if we're bringing water into the classroom, to not bring it in a plastic one-use bottle. Use a metal bottle that you can fill up, and if you can encourage your colleagues to do the same thing, then how what a great example that is. And then it also gives you the chance to talk about metal as opposed to plastic. And it can lead on to a whole load of different subjects.
And I think talk is the key, because it can be an abstract concept for little children. It needs a lot of discussion, a lot of scaffolding, and a lot of revisiting around simple things like, has Mr. Clegg filled up his bottle today? And then you can talk about why you fill up your bottle, and if the children have got bottles, and there you go. Again, sometimes I've seen on Pinterest or on Facebook, you might find somebody with a tough spot that's just full of random rubbish and a little laminated sign that says, sort out our recycling. And you've got some 4-year-olds that are left to their own devices to kind of sort this big mound into 2 buckets, which is neither interesting nor exciting, because there's no adult there to support that learning, or a tough spot that's split into a bit of sand and a bit of sea, and then there are plastic bags and things, and the activity is to fish out the plastic out of the sea. And again, the message is that plastic shouldn't be in the oceans, but again, it's quite an abstract concept. If you're 3, you're really more excited about using a fishing net and fishing something out of a tray than you are thinking, well, actually, what I'm thinking about here is that plastic shouldn't be in the sea. So it's about taking those big concepts, which are important, but trying to filter them down and dilute them down so they make sense to children of the age that we're dealing with.
And there are lots of good books that you can read about these things. I've got a list on the Gecko website, like Neil Layton's Plastic Free World. That some of these things do it in a positive way and explain what happens to plastic. It does last for hundreds and hundreds of years, whereas other things don't. And we don't want to eat plastic, do we?
This is true. But even what can we do with plastic in our setting if you've got it? And you can do things like making plastic bag kites where you just tie a bit of string around one handle. If you've got the bags, again, it's not, like we mentioned in one of our other episodes, it's not about saying get everything you've got that's remotely plastic and throw it out, because then you are literally...
They're literally making it worse. I actually loved, I went to a conference recently and I listened to some people from Africa where they have very, very few toys, but they were making toys out of some plastic. So, for example, when you buy tangerines and clementines, they often come in that plastic mesh bag, which most of us would just lob in general waste. Well, what they did was they filled those bags with bread bags, you know, the plastic bags that bread come in, and they stuffed them in, and they could actually make a ball out of it. And then they used the ball as a ball. Well, why not? You know, so we have things to learn from those cultures.
Literally, why not? They're also really good for putting dough in and squeezing through the holes. You can roll it through to make a pattern. Also, plastic bottles, if you've got them, and an adult or a child who's good with scissors, cuts the neck bit off.
Yeah.
And then, believe me, it works. It won't ruin your iron. You have an iron on a low setting, and you just gently push the jacket top against the iron, flattens it out, and you can make clear plastic pencil pots or paint pots. So it's using what you've got and then saying, right, yeah, in my setting, I do have a whole shelf full of plastic pots, but we made those plastic pots by recycling plastic bottles.
Be proud of that. You know, buying your resources in thrift shops and scrap stores and things, that's marvelous good practice and something to share with children and their parents, and to be proud of that. Keeping the cost down, which obviously we all want as well. But we're really doing a good thing for the community. This word thrift needs to come back into being a really fashionable, respected word.
It really does. And you mentioned Australia before, and I've been really lucky enough to do some work out in Australia. And a lot of the early childhood settings that I worked in Australia, well, certainly where I was working, you put anything you don't want on the path and it stays out there for 48 hours. Yeah. And after 48 hours, somebody comes and picks it up from the local council. But for those 48 hours, it's anybody's. So if you drive past and somebody's put a chair out and you fancy it, you just chuck it in the back of the car. So loads of settings had units, cupboards, dressers, and obviously you've got to make sure that they're finger safe so you're not chopping children's fingers, but they were old pieces of furniture that sometimes were painted, sometimes refurbished, sometimes the doors were taken off and they were just used as open units. But also there's a lot of research around the fact that when children are in an environment where they can make connections to familiar items, so not necessarily items that are exactly what they've got at home, but rather than being that kind of IKEA bookshelf or that space that feels a bit like a hospital because it's all white and clinical, if I've got a piece of furniture or a lamp or a comfy chair, that makes my brain relax because it feels familiar. So what a lot they talked about was the fact they were creating settings that felt like you walked into somebody's home environment, because not only was that, you know, good for children's learning and well-being, but it also was brilliant for sustainability, reusing and recycling. And there were some amazing pieces of furniture that looked fantastic.
It's been such fun to resource nurseries like that. And also, I mean, we've got some marvellous tea services that we've got from charity shops. And, they can be very, very beautiful. And yes, they do break from time to time. But you know what? If you've bought them for 5p, that's a great learning experience. You know, a child learns that if they're not careful with moving the cup and saucer around the home corner and they do drop it on the floor, it will break. So they've learned that in a safe environment, there's going to be no, oh my goodness, that's naughty, because that's not something we say in a nursery or a school, is it? We'll say, well, yeah, that's what happens when you drop this particular material. So we have to be careful when we move it around. And then you go back to the charity shop and buy a few more. After all, somebody's thrown those away. So it's actually a very useful recycling of those porcelain products. But I would say that sometimes when we have a whole new intake in September, we have to put those away for a little bit because so many get broken. It's difficult to guide that. And then as the children settle down and kind of normalise in the setting, we can gradually introduce those more breakable items and expect them to survive.
Exactly, because if we think about it, the majority of children don't have a lived experience of having a cup of tea out of a china cup.
No.
So it can bring value, but they will see it as a resource, not in the way that we see it. And yes, that's why they get broken. And I think what we try to say through all of the episodes that we've done is that it's about that why do we have it bit. So it's not about saying, which I think I sometimes see on social media, if you haven't got a china tea set, then you can't be a valid early years practitioner. If you haven't got a copper kettle, you can't be a valid early years practitioner.
No,
it's about saying there are lots of elements that these things can bring to your setting. One being sustainability, one being exploration, one being new opportunities to experience something different. But again, you only bring them in if you understand that's why, rather than saying, I'm just going to have one because everybody else has got one, and then I get frustrated when they get broken, because that will happen.
It will, yeah. And that's fine. That's partly why you've got them there. And you will find that, after they've had those materials for a little while, they won't break them. And actually, it's the same with pets. If you really have to have pets, you've really got to do that pet husbandry really, really well. And unless you're sure that you've got somebody in the team that will take the lead and responsibility, much better.
And take that guinea pig home.
Yeah, exactly. At the weekends and whatever. It's much better to, perhaps work with the birds in the garden and look at bird feeders and putting water out for the birds and what are the names of the different birds. Or we're very lucky in one setting, we've got ducks that are on the hospital lake. And that's marvelous because they come and lay eggs in the nests that they make around the nursery. And that's such a wonderful, natural learning experience.
I think you're right. That idea of a pet's not an essential, and a lot of things you do in terms of looking after a pet and the skills that children get, you can get by encouraging wildlife into your space. I, as a very new teacher, got 2 guinea pigs for my reception class, a fluffy one and a not so fluffy one. And then the fluffy one had babies, and everybody was like giddy with excitement that the guinea pig had given birth. And then it ate them all. We came in the following day to find there were no babies left because the mother guinea pig had eaten all the babies. And then I had 30 reception children, actually I had 38 reception children who came in with their parents, siblings, saying, can we see the guinea pig babies? And we had to, rather than say the mother ate them, it was very early on in my career, where I had some convoluted story about how I'd given them back to the pet shop so that other boys and girls could enjoy a guinea pig. But I'm not saying that will always happen, but nobody tells you about that when you buy guinea pigs. And actually, what we could have done was got a lot of value, as you're saying, out of just feeding the birds, talking about real life habitats, all that kind of thing.
And respect. I mean, I have a few nurseries that have a rabbit, but the rabbit is pretty much nearly as big as a dog. They get so big, and they kind of hop around the nursery at will. And some you can even potty train them, as it were, which is also quite an interesting thing to do with children, to talk about what happens with your body products. But it's a huge challenge, compared to watching the birds outside. And one of our nurseries got bats, so they can watch bats in the evening, which is quite fun. But obviously, if your children all leave at 3, that's not going to work. I think you have to work with the local, what you've got and what you can encourage. And if you've got no garden birds visiting you, why not? And can you do something about that? Because there's obviously a major problem at the moment with species, fading and going extinction. So what can we do to help our local community? And you might find the RSPB will come in and give you advice, or give you advice over the phone, as well as websites. You could get some expert to come in and really talk to you about, the local flora and fauna and what you can do as a nursery to help and teach your children about it.
And we're going to have to end on this bit, but even mini beasts and insects. I mean, I know bees. Who hasn't kept a beetle in a matchbox, but bees, the fact that you can encourage those mini beasts to come into your space, not put them in matchboxes, and look after them, feed them, create appropriate habitats. Yeah, not the same as a gerbil or a guinea pig, but equally, you're talking to children about all of the similar issues around what do these animals need, how can we provide it, what can we understand about them. So there's lots that can be gained just from what you've got under a plant pot.
Absolutely.
So you don't necessarily have to spend the money on the vivarium the animal, the husbandry, and then
Vets.
taking them home at weekends, all of that.
Oh, yeah, and you can still teach respect and empathy with other living creatures that way, which is such an important skill for our children to learn. And
you can
3
always
is the
borrow
age for really learning about trying to put yourself. How would you feel if you were a worm and someone took, the lid off your house? And there's so much
How would
opportunity
you feel?
there for putting yourself in another animal's position. And I know some people say, well, it's, don't over-humanize animals, but actually animals do have feelings, and do feel pain. So it's very important to teach our children about that.
And if you want, send a letter home and say, if you've got a guinea pig, if you've got a hamster, I mean, hamsters are rubbish anyway because they sleep all day. Can we
And they bite.
borrow your pet? Bring it in. Let's have a look at it. But that's easier than keep them on a long time. Anyway, literally, we could talk about, after 30 years, nearly years, I have lots of pet stories, some which are appropriate to repeat and some which really aren't.
Me too.
But once again, we've come to the end of another brilliant episode. Thank you so much, Cheryl, once again, for just giving us loads of insight, loads of information, and lots to get thinking about.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
So all it leaves for me to do is to say a huge thank you to our guest, Cheryl, for joining us and providing such valuable insights and ideas all around sustainability in the early years. So you've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and with Cheryl Hadland. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, then don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes, and then you'll be the first to hear about future episodes. But also, doing that, you can access some exclusive follow-up content, and that includes things like ideas for your setting, Pinterest boards that will help you to shop for resources that are all linked to sustainability and sustainable practices within the early years.